Hi there. Can I get a some sort of recognition that you can hear me on Zoom? Thumbs up, something? Yes, perfect. Thank you. All right. Welcome everyone to session E1 on data literacy. My name is Nicky Agate. I am the Assistant University Librarian for Research Data and Digital Scholarship at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm really thrilled to be here with you today on my first IASSIST. All right, so our first speakers are all from the University of New Hampshire, and they're going to be presenting on data integrity, a cornerstone of rigorous and reproducible research. Dr. Julie Simpson is Director of Research Integrity Services at the University of New Hampshire and an affiliate assistant professor of college teaching and education. She administers the university's human subjects protections, humane care and use of vertebrate animals, and responsible conduct of research and scholarly activity programs. And every year she co-teaches ethics in research and scholarship, a cross-disciplinary graduate seminar. She's presenting today with two colleagues, Dr. Maria Emanuel, the Partnerships Manager for UNH's Research and Large Center Development Office, where she supports collaborative and interdisciplinary research initiatives, manages the university's Collaborative Research Excellence Internal Seed Grant Program, and focuses on external partnerships and research engagement. She's an affiliate assistant professor of college teaching and co-teaches that Ethics in Research and Scholarship seminar. And finally, Dr. Patricia Condon is assistant professor and research data services librarian at UNH. In this role, she collaborates with units across campus to support the growing data management and data literacy needs of the UNH scholarly community. She's a member of the IRB and Responsible Conduct of Research and Scholarly Activity Committee. And I believe that she is going to be sharing her screen with us today. All right, Patricia, when you're ready, please take it away.
Great, thank you very much. I just want to make sure I'm heard in the room across Zoom. Great. Thanks for attending our presentation, Data Integrity, a cornerstone of rigorous, reproducible research. And thank you very much for the conference organizers. I'm Patricia Condon from the University of New Hampshire, and my co-authors, Dr. Simpson and Dr. Emanuel, unfortunately, they can't join us today, so I'm presenting on behalf of our group. Today, we're going to present on our concept model for data integrity and our schema for implementing data integrity throughout the data lifecycle. So we embarked on this project to better articulate the relationship between the terms data integrity, data management, data quality, and data security, while clearly conveying their role in the research life cycles. The motivation arose from a student's question in the graduate seminar on research integrity that Maria and Julie teach, and in which I guest lecture on the topic of responsible research data management. The question was, what is the difference between data quality and data integrity? It prompted us to reflect further, and after the course ended, we met regularly to develop this topic. The primacy of data in empirical scientific research, in trustworthy findings, and in the creation of knowledge requires a focus on data integrity from the inception of a study through the dissemination of the findings and the subsequent sharing of data. And further, data integrity is important in interdisciplinary research and in collaborative cross-sector research, where there are different norms, procedures, and terminology regarding data. And it's also important in terms of resource stewardship and risk management. So in light of this, we wanted to consider the utility of data integrity in practice for data producers, providers, users, and educators. And finally, the need to understand the concept of research data integrity is essential due to the key role that it plays in the 4 R's, or rigorous science, reproducible science, replication, and data reuse. Data integrity plays a role in research that is rigorous, outcomes that are reproducible and replicable, and data that can be reused. Rigor in any discipline is the gold standard, and in some fields, reproducibility and replicability are also gold standards. And data integrity is critical to reproducibility efforts. And although the lack of replicability is not always a data integrity issue, it certainly plays an important role in the successful attempts. And as you undoubtedly are aware, research rigor and reproducibility are really hot topics in some disciplines and for some funding agencies. And the reusability of data is always desirable, and moreover, hinges on data integrity and the trustworthiness of that original data set. So on the slide, you'll see the definitions of the terms. They're cited where the definitions that we use to define these. So next, I want to unpack the complexity of data integrity. For a start, multiple definitions of the concept abound, right? The term can be used to describe the state of data, for example, either valid or invalid, or the process of ensuring and preserving the validity and accuracy of data. Fundamental to most definitions are kind of two components: the notion of reliability and trustworthiness of the data, and a state that applies to data throughout the data lifecycle. And finally, there are two types of data integrity. There's physical integrity and there's logical integrity. So another confounding factor is that different sectors often focus on different components of data integrity. In academia, we might focus on data management and scientific research data, whereas in a business community, they might focus on the security of data, that is keeping their data safe from competitors. And in certain industries, particularly health-related fields, they might focus on the quality of data due to the importance of the development of their products and interventions. So all of these cause problems or confounding issues really for data providers, producers, and users. The definitions and concepts sort of lack a holistic approach to data integrity in that they each address a certain aspect, but none really present an overarching framework. And there's no standardized sort of terminology or definitions. And the current definition and concepts sort of lack utility for practitioners and educators, as they don't adequately convey what's needed to be addressed to ensure research integrity throughout a research study, or what trainees might need to be taught about conducting research. And finally, they also sort of lack an adequacy for protecting data integrity in practice from the myriad of threats such as error, cyber threats, hardware or software malfunctions, or physical threats to hardware and devices. So as we refined our own understanding of data integrity, we found that data integrity was often expressed as being closely associated with data management, data quality, and data security. So we proposed a three-part concept model that integrated a definition of data integrity and each of the core components. And it clarifies the relationship among the components and then emphasizes that fundamental role of documentation and training. So we refer to this as the data integrity concept model. So this concept model, we move from a static representation of data to a more dynamic representation of how data integrity is made stronger by the interplay of these three components: data management, quality, and security. The model really visualizes the interactions between the components. It highlights how the different concepts are unique in their function and how they interact with one another to sort of form a more holistic understanding of data integrity. It's this shared space between the components where we move from just the concepts used to define data integrity to meaningful interactions between components as an approach to data integrity. The interplay between the components gives us shared outcomes, shared processes, shared states that contribute to data integrity. And integral to the model is documentation and training, both essential to data integrity, its components, and for promoting the centrality of those 4 R's. So to address what data integrity looks like in practice, we turn to the research life cycles. Lifecycle models are visual tools that can help researchers plan aspects of their research project. So the research project life cycle, the outer ring of the image on the screen, provides a broad characterization of research project activity, and it provides an outline for planning high quality research. A research data life cycle, the inner ring, provides a high level overview of working with data from the planning stages before data are generated to preserving data for the future and beyond the life of the original project. Ideally, these life cycles inform each other in a continuous dynamic process, as illustrated by this graphic, or tried to be illustrated by the graphic. The project life cycle as the outer ring and the data life cycle as this inner ring, or an aspect of that project life cycle. In practice, researchers may not consciously identify the actions they perform in ensuring data integrity throughout these research life cycles. So using the research data life cycle as a guide, we mapped each stage to corresponding actions and processes taken by researchers as they work with their data through the course of a project. So here's a graphic that's a little bit wild, but we're going to walk through it, okay? So on the left, you see the stages of the life cycle, and on the right, you see processes and actions that researchers take during the course of projects. We refer to this as the data integrity implementation schema. Data integrity needs to be maintained throughout that entire life cycle of data. And these actions and processes taken by researchers ensure well-managed, secure, documented, and quality data. So with this schema, we wanted to identify at which stage in the life cycle different components of data integrity are addressed. We highlight what activities performed by researchers contribute to each component of data integrity. And we take the concept model and we merge it with the data lifecycle model, a more practical model, to make a schema that's actionable with potential use in training and education. Over the next several slides, I'll progress through the elements of the schema. I'm not going to go into detail about the mapping, but rather want to break the schema apart so you can see how it comes together. I want to draw your attention to how each stage of the life cycle is associated with activities that correspond with multiple, and in most cases, all of the components of data integrity. It isn't simply that data quality, for example, is achieved at a single point in the data life cycle, but that it's achieved throughout multiple activities that take place throughout the life cycle. This schema further emphasizes the intersections between the components of data integrity, as illustrated in our concept model. The researcher's actions and the components are not isolated, but they interact with one another to build a web supporting data integrity. For me, this mapping between the stages of the data lifecycle and activities associated with the components that contribute to it, to data integrity, illustrates the complexity of what data integrity looks like in practice. In particular, there isn't one thing that researchers do to support data integrity, or for that matter, one thing to support quality, security, or management of the data. And when taken together, it illustrates the significance of data integrity and its components when considering the role of data in rigorous science, reproducible science, replication, and data reuse throughout not only the research data lifecycle, but the overarching research process as well. So the 4 R's take careful planning to achieve, including during each stage of the research data and project life cycles. By integrating data integrity components into each of those life cycles, we can protect data integrity and thus strengthen the opportunity for transformative research. Specifically, planning for the 4 R's and data integrity supports interdisciplinary and collaborative research by enabling a shared vocabulary and philosophy across disciplines and research perspectives. It supports the allocation or stewardship of research resources, such as people, time, funding, and training. And data integrity also supporting it serves as a risk management and education tool. A methodical and holistic approach to data integrity can reduce the risk of errors related to both the state of data as well as the process of creating, using, and managing it. And it does so by providing a framework to define and standardize research roles, vocabulary, and the data integrity elements of data management, data security, and data quality. To prioritize the dynamic and critical relationship between data integrity and the data and project life cycles, we suggest 3 practical approaches to applying the model and schema. I'm sorry, but my video just went out. Sorry about that. So in the classroom, data integrity can be explored through theoretical discussions and hands-on activities such as case studies and explorations of creating, managing, and analyzing data sets with multiple decision points as you go. Importantly, these activities should be conducted across all disciplines and levels of academic instruction and provide not only an opportunity to address the 4 R's, but also that critical need for teaching data literacy. And data integrity training can be incorporated into existing channels that support students and researchers through activities like standardized trainings for new students and new employees, research workshops that jointly engage both new and experienced researchers, team or lab meetings, and online resources or guides, etc. It's also critical to cultivate an institutional culture that includes an open dialogue about data integrity and the 4 R's. Components of an institutional culture include policies that relate to research data, such as ownership, about the ownership of data, management, use, and sharing. Also deploying necessary resources and dedicated personnel, efforts to promote data integrity and related discussions and learning opportunities. And leveraging institutional research communication channels to share best practices and success stories. So we recognize that data integrity is complicated, and we believe that purposeful planning and education enables researchers to conduct rigorous research and generate outcomes that not only reflect the desired data integrity characteristics, but are also reproducible, replicable, and reusable. Our model and schema enable the complexity of data integrity to be taught effectively and addressed with intentionality. In addition, they provide a framework for researchers to be intentional in their planning around data integrity and research integrity more broadly. With the added layers of documentation and training, we demonstrate that the interplay between data management, data quality, and data security comprise a crucial and viable framework to realize data integrity with the goal of achieving robust science and ultimately advancing our knowledge in the world around us and preserving that public trust in science. In future work, these models, applying these models to discipline-specific case examples and curriculum development will further illustrate their utility in practice and reinforce the role of data integrity in the 4 Rs. So we want to thank a couple of individuals for their valuable contributions, including, with their permission, including Isabella Saul, who was the graduate student whose question sort of started this conversation, and also Sandra Hickey, who translated our ideas into the graphics. I just want to provide a handful of citations that supported the slides in particular. We do plan to publish a paper, and it's a more in-depth analysis on data integrity, as well as more sources and valuable insights on the topic. Here's some contact information. We welcome additional questions and comments after the session concludes. You're happy to hear from anyone if they have thoughts about this. And then I want to say thank you. And I'm not sure if we're taking questions now or holding it to the end. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. I think we can take some questions now. Does anyone in the room have questions? Thank you. And I'll just check the chat.
Hey there, I'm Paula Lackey from Carleton College, and I've been trying to get my campus to understand data management, just generally speaking. And now we have this great opportunity because Google has cut unlimited access to their storage. And this has given us the ability to transfer everybody's concepts of I put everything in Google to I should really curate my stuff, except they don't use any of that language. Except stuff, get rid of. That's what is retained. So I'm trying to think, have you used this for like offices, simple file management for offices or departments and individuals? Have these things, it looks completely transferable with a little bit of tweaking of the language.
Yeah, and that was, I mean, part of our goal was to make it transferable with basically tweaking, because although we started from a very, I mean, I'd say it was a very scientific research data perspective that we started with, but our goal was so that it could be transferable to other types of data and thinking. And so including, business offices and administrative data. We haven't used this yet. So, and that's sort of the next stage of this, is seeing what this looks like in applying it and seeing how implementation goes, and then making tweaks, to sort of based on that in practice. But I understand your question. I empathize with your question based on my experience in my role here at UNH as well. The sort of having to adapt our own language and to work with researchers and others around file management and appraising or curating their collections is very challenging. And so, and it's not an easy thing, but it's a great idea. And I think that what you're making me think about now is maybe a sort of a conversation about how this could be adapted for different scenarios as well would be really helpful. sorry to not have a better answer, but it's what you're facing is so challenging, and I empathize because I work with, I do that regularly too. So
Thank you. We probably have time for one more question, either from our remote visitors or in the room. No. Patricia, can I ask you to stop sharing your screen?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very
And
much.
Kathleen, can I ask you to start sharing yours?
Yes.
So our next speaker is Kathleen Weldon, the Director of Data Operations and Communications at the Roper Center. Kathleen manages data provider relations, oversees the data curation process, plans archival development, and works closely with the IT development team in building new user tools. She's a graduate of Wesleyan University with a BA in English and started her career in public opinion at Harvard University, designing surveys with media and foundation partners. Thank you, Kathleen, and take it away.
Thank you. Forgive me if my voice gives out a bit. I am still recovering from COVID from the last conference I attended. So here I am remotely. I am from the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research, which is an independent nonprofit data archive that is hosted by Cornell University. The Roper Center, as many of you may know, is the oldest social science data archive in the world. It's been around since 1947. We have only public opinion surveys, so polling data, and we have a large collection of data sets, but we also have what we refer to as iPoll, which is a question bank with top line aggregate results from primarily US national polls dating back to 1935. There are over 815,000 questions in iPoll at this point. It's incredibly large. So of course, one of the great values of having something that goes back that far is the ability to look at over time data to track public opinion changes over time. But to this point, it has been very difficult to do that using the iPoll database. However, we received funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for the creation of the Health Poll database, which is a portal into just the health-related data within iPoll. And with that funding, we were able to create a trend building tool that is built on the questions in the database. Now, there are a few things to know about that database. One, each question is independently understandable. So all of the information, basic information about sample size and population, and any sort of filter, subpopulation, asked only of parents, asked only of voters, is included in a note on the individual question. So you have a lot of information presented on each question that can be pulled and used individually. Also, they are manually entered. We base this database on public press releases so that it can be timely. Things go in right away, and it's not entirely dependent on a data provider being willing to share their data sets with us. So those are important things to keep in mind when you're thinking about how we're creating a trend builder tool using the database. Trend builder, as we do call it, is internal to the Roper Center. We are not making this at this time an external tool. There may be a future in that. The tool searches for similar questions in the database. So you start with the base question. It looks for questions that look very much like that. And then it allows the user to normalize the response categories, eliminate questions that don't fit into the trend because the sample population is wrong, etc. And we publish them. The ones that are visible now are visible only in Health Poll database. They're all health related, but we will be moving at some point in the future, hopefully not the too far future, to having the same access to trends in the general iPoll database on more than just health. So what did we what challenges do we face in figuring out how to implement the trends? The expectations and standard for what is a trend? These are rather field specific. Economists, for example, tend to be a little stricter. Polling is pretty flexible. There aren't many planned trends. There are some many-year surveys, but many of the most important trends in polling are done across multiple organizations. They are on different time schemes. Organizations drop or add questions. They borrow wordings from other organizations. And some questions are only repeated when things are in the news. So questions about the Supreme Court, for example, tend to show up when there is a new appointment to the Supreme Court, and not in between. Also, individual researchers have a differing tolerance for the variation. So some researchers are perfectly happy mixing sample populations, likely voters with registered voters. And some researchers do not want to cross even different polling houses. So we had to figure out what our tolerance was for variation at the Roper Center, what we wanted to set as sort of the field standards, because this is what people are going to be using while still serving our users as best as possible. So what we had to think about mostly was, what do we control? What do they control? We wanted to make sure that people who were relatively casual users, undergraduates or even journalists, would be able to pull a trustworthy trend that followed best practices. But we also wanted to make sure that advanced researchers could customize and do the things that they want to do fairly easily. So that essentially meant the difference between our inclusion or exclusion in a trend, adding filters, and providing downloadable data so that researchers could go further with this. So these are the elements we identified as being important to consider: the target population, the wording of the question, the response categories, the field organizations, mode of interview, sampling procedures, and gap periods in the trend. How long between instances of the question? So let's go through those. Target population, we were very strict about. Most of these are national adult polls. There are some others, but we required identical target populations. The end user has some power here. So if there are two trends that are very similar or the same wording, and one is a likely voter trend and one is a registered voter trend, they can simply download a CSV file and fold those two together. They'll be formatted the same. It's a copy paste. It's very easy. But since personally, I would not put a likely voter and a registered voter sample together, we are not necessarily encouraging that practice. We're keeping with a stricter definition here of a trend. However, on modes, standard practice in polling is to sort of mix modes willy-nilly. There are mode effects, certainly, particularly on sensitive questions. So what we allow here is for mode to be filtered by the end user. So if the question you're looking at is something that you think will be different, results will be different based on whether it was done in person or in the anonymity of a web survey, you can remove one or the other and look at that comparison easily. We did, however, need to collapse our metadata. We have more granular metadata that was just going to be confusing to end users. So we collapsed all of the phone polls, cell, landline, mixed into just phone. Oh, question wording. So this is a pretty common question, widely used in political science for general measure of how people feel about things. And you can see these are some of the wordings that are used for what is probably the same question. Would you say the United States is headed in the right direction? We say things in the country, things in the nation, in this country. Are they headed in the right direction, going in the right direction? Are they moving in the right direction? Are things on the wrong track, gotten off on the wrong track, seriously off on the wrong track, pretty seriously off on the wrong track? These are all variants that may or may not make an actual difference in responses, and gives us an example of the types of things we had to consider. What exactly counts as a trend. For question wording, we were extremely strict. There were some acceptable changes. So we did not footnote it when the change was Democrats in Congress versus the Democrats in Congress. We footnoted some very minor changes, but did include things in the trend. A very common one there is the inclusion or exclusion of the word that. Do you think there will be a zombie apocalypse? Do you think that there will be a zombie apocalypse? We think that means the same thing, and is unlikely to affect response. But we do try to footnote. We want to make sure everyone is comfortable and aware of any changes that occur. Response categories are very strict, have to stick with the same scale. However, it's a big part of the process is normalizing these because the way that they are entered in IPOL varies quite a bit. This is just a difference in how they're presented in the top line documents. So the question may be, did you vote in the last election or not? And the answers, the responses will be described in the document as yes, I voted, yes, did vote, yes, or voted. It's still the same question. And that respondent, probably on the telephone, was saying one of those things and it was being counted in that category. It's just how the category was described in the actual release document. So we have to do a lot of normalization, but it's not actually changing any content. House effects, one of the big values of the IPOL database is that you can find questions from many organizations. Most pollsters are very comfortable with merging work from different organizations. However, some are concerned about house effects, and there are some real house effects, which is to say one survey organization may sort of bully its respondents into giving an answer, even if they want to volunteer or don't know. Whereas another organization may accept and immediately volunteer don't know. And then you get a difference between a 1% don't know and a 17% don't know on certain questions. That's a meaningful house effect. And therefore, we wanted to make sure that the end user could look at that. So this is another case like mode where we allowed filtering after the fact. Sampling procedures are a bit more complicated. Most of our data in the collection, certainly most of the trends, are drawn from our long-standing methods collection, probability-based polling. So the long-standing methods collection, we do have a recently developed method collection, which involves things like online quota-based polling. But the long-standing methods collection is primarily probability-based. However, the early years of polling was quota-based, and it's not always very well documented. Certain organizations sort of flipped a switch and moved from quota to probability, but often they blurred the distinctions and mixed it up for a little while. They didn't always document that. So we were unable to really filter based on that, since we were never really sure about particular studies. We just put a footnote if it crosses that time frame and tell people to look at the documentation to see what effects might have been caused by changes in sampling procedure. Gaps. We wanted to be strict about gaps. And we kept finding that there were really long, valuable trends that were being broken into many trends because there were gaps of more than 2 years. And it was a rather arbitrary choice, 2 years. So first we wanted to extend it, maybe we'll make it 3, maybe we'll make it 4, but we're getting uncomfortable. We finally decided on a very simple technical solution, which was to include anything, any size gap, but to give a different style of line. So the under a 2-year gap is a solid line, 2 to 10 years is a dashed line, and a over 10 years is a dotted line, so that we can make sure that users have a clue that even though we want you to see the earlier questions, or the questions that are separated by a large gap, because they do inform each other, you do not know what's happening. The bigger the gap gets, the less information you actually have about where that trend may have moved within that time frame. Okay, so this is the tool, and I don't even have to do this. I've got it recorded here. So put in the question. So I'm working off this question. What kind of leadership roles should the US play in the world? I am searching for it in our longstanding methods collection. I set the minimum similarity very low. So the similarity is going to be the comparison with, is this actually running? Oh, please run. Yes, it is. Oh, it's searching. That's our wombat. You can see these are all high similarity. Gives you the count on those. You can look at the details. We see the response categories. So if, say, there's some variation there, it will start to show up. I select all of these. These all look like they should be part of the trend. Wombat shows up again. Here's where I can remove samples that don't fit. I don't really want the people who got called back after a debate. It's a little different, just the international adult. I can move along. Here's that normalization part, and this is why it takes so long. So the question should be a single world leader, play a shared leadership role. Shouldn't it play a leadership role at all? Those have been described. You can see play a shared leadership role, single world leader, be a single world leader, shared leader. So normalizing this is a big part of the process of doing creating a trend. And yes, I sped up this section. It still takes forever. Okay, next. Then we see the trend. We can change the colors. We can see the subpopulation notes on the particular question instances, which allows us to check for things like, oh, even though the whole survey was of registered voters, this particular question was only of Democrats. Clear that out. Go in here, then we just add title, description, and the core question, plus any of those notes that we need to add to make sure that it's clear. Notes about the early quotas, notes about minor changes in question wording, etc. And there you go. We have to remove punctuation for the search tool to work really well. Commas don't bother it too much, but it hates exclamation points, question marks, and there's our trend. So that is the working of the actual. 2 minutes left. Okay, 1 minute left. And here's a trend completed and done as the user would see it. There's that filtering ability of the modes in the survey orgs, the citation. You could grab the image, download the data package. So what are we, I'll skip this one, but basically we go back and forth between iPull and the trend building software. And we get a scan every week of new questions to see if it matches any of the existing trends so they can stay up to date. Currently, we have 350 published trends in the health poll database. We have 400 additional trends built that are not health related. The potential for trends were at least 3,500, probably more. And I made it in the time frame, just.
All right, can we give Kathleen a round of applause? Thank you so much, Kathleen. And does anyone either attending virtually or in the room have a question? Any questions at all? Oh, there's one in the back.
Yep. Oh, also Bob Ray.
So thank you very much. It was very interesting presentation. But I've got a question. Do you measure, apart from collecting the information on the question wording, do you measure also some properties of these questions? Because if some properties of these questions, like, for example, like in the tool SQP or similar, some properties, you know, the
properties of the question.
Properties of this question, yeah. Because if you had such a database, then it could be very useful for some methodological analysis on question wording, right? So of course,
Absolutely.
this is even if you don't have it, so it's still very useful because I can do it by myself, but maybe you are collecting such information. So
this is the first step in what I hope will be a much deeper exploration of questions, their relationship to each other, their use and variation. We have big plans on making the database more functional for the exploration of questions and not just of top-line results from questions. But that is not a currently funded plan. So this is the first step. And really the first step was identifying the identical questions. And we determined that of that 800,000 questions, about half of those were unique questions, and the other half represented a lot of repeated questions. So that was important to know to get started. But yes, I think that is a direction we should be going. No, we're not there yet.
Funders take note. Okay.
Funders take note. You have money? I've got ideas.
All right, we're going to move on to our third set of speakers now. Elizabeth Hill, Kristi Thompson, and Alexandra Cooper. So one of you want to share your screen. I'm not sure who's going to share their screen, and I'll just introduce you. So these three are going to talk about thinking critically about sources, a recipe for data literacy. Elizabeth Hill has been a data librarian at Western University in London, Ontario in Canada since 1998. She provides access and data literacy instruction to data products and has an external advisor role with Statistics Canada. She's active in various data communities and working groups in participant and leadership roles. Her research interests include supporting researchers, and she has published on topics related to data delivery systems and data librarianship in Canada. Kristi Thompson is the Research Data Management Librarian at Western University and has previously held positions as data librarian at the University of Windsor and data specialist at Princeton University. She supports research projects, teaches workshops on data handling, and administers data archiving software. She co-edited the book Data Librarianship, the Academic Data Librarian in Theory and Practice with my colleague Linda Cullum from ACRL, and has published on topics ranging from survey anonymization algorithms to medical school admissions. And finally, Alexandra Cooper has been providing data reference support at Queen's University, also in Canada, since 2004, most recently as the Data Services Coordinator, including research data management support to students, faculty, and researchers. She has leadership roles at the national level, developing resources, guidance, and training to support data repositories and RDM in Canadian universities. All right, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Hi, this is Kristi Thompson. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming. This conference presentation grew out of a book chapter that Elizabeth Hill, Alexandra Cooper, and I wrote for an upcoming data literacy cookbook. The cookbook chapter provides a fairly brief, practical set of instructions, a recipe, for putting together an information literacy session on data sources for a course. We wanted to use this conference session to expand on some of the thinking behind that recipe and talk a bit more generally about our pedagogical approach to teaching about data. Many data instruction sessions start by showing students a website or a database and explaining how to use that site to find and extract data on some particular topic. And I've listened to and given sessions of that type. But I started to rethink that approach after dealing with one too many students who came to me all upset because they'd been searching the Canadian government's Statistics Canada website for hours and couldn't understand why they weren't finding what they wanted. And it was immediately obvious to me that the statistic they wanted would never have been collected by the government in the first place. or in some cases would never be collected by anyone, ever. The students were wasting their time searching, and I'd been wasting their time teaching them how to search, because this stuff that was intuitively obvious to me was not at all apparent to them. The problem they were having wasn't not knowing how to search. They were applying keywords perfectly well. The problem was not knowing what to search for or why. Things that were obvious to me were not obvious to them, and I realized I was starting my teaching in the wrong place. So I started to move away from the take a site and search it approach, and instead began on a journey to try and take this implicit knowledge of what sort of data can be found in what sources and why, to take my implicit knowledge, deconstruct it, and turn it into something that I could teach, a framework for thinking about data collection and dissemination. And I found that some of my colleagues have taken similar journeys. So I ended up working with Liz and Alex on this. It's simply not possible to demonstrate every single possible data source that a student might need to know about. So another option is to talk about the processes of data collection, in particular, who collects data, who shares data, and why they do so, or might not do so. Give students a framework for thinking about what data is likely to exist and where. And equally importantly, why some data may not exist or may not be accessible. Here's a quick quote from the ACRL Framework for Information Literacy that captures our approach to data literacy. The framework says that information creation is a process. Information in any format is produced to convey a message and is shared via a selected delivery method. Data creation obviously is also a process. Any given piece of data has been collected, processed, and disseminated for a purpose. So our approach can be summed up as understanding data as an information source means understanding where data comes from, which means also understanding who, why, and how. Who collects data? What purposes is it collected for? And how is it collected, compiled, and published? Over the next few slides, I'm going to be focusing on public data and delving into the questions of who, why, what, and how. So who collects data? Rather than giving an exhaustive list, I've broken down the possible sources of information into four main types. Public data is data collected by governments or intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank. Sources with some sort of legal or treaty authority to collect data. Things such as the national census of whatever country, the World Bank's Living Standard Measurement Surveys, the United Nations studies, and so on. Nonprofits are also a good sort of data. Things like non-governmental organizations, charities, think tanks. A third group to consider are academic sources, including individual researchers and larger scale research projects. These are basically a special case of usually nonprofit that collect data for reasons that are not always immediately practical or apparent. And finally, private sources, media, corporations, and so on. These people collect lots of data, but with some exceptions, such as Roper, they don't always feel like sharing it. So why this focus on public data? It's about the money. It's always about the money. Most publicly available data comes from public institutions, governments, and nonprofits. Publicly funded institutions have a mandate to spend their money towards certain goals and are held accountable to the public. Private institutions or businesses have no such mandate and are not accountable beyond whatever is required by law. They may collect a lot of data for their own use, but they're under no obligation to share it. So finding data on a population or a topic often means figuring out what public organization has access to that population or is interested in that topic, and then seeing what those organizations have available. Again, academics are a bit of a special case since it's not always possible to predict if they will share their data or not. as much as we would like them to. So what do these public organizations collect? Governments in particular primarily collect data relevant to government policy that they consider worth the cost of collecting. Charities, agencies, NGOs and IGOs and other public organizations collect data for similar reasons, to help carry out their mission or to plan or evaluate services. So to help clarify that concept, here's an overview of some main types of data collected by governments and why they are collected. Yes, they collect basic population and health information so that they can do various basic types of planning around health services and so on. They collect employment and unemployment information and income information so they can figure out things like taxes and other types of planning like that. They collect lots of financial information, especially at the regional level, so that they can set economic policies. They collect agricultural information, and that's something that helps them set food policies. They often collect information on consumer spending, which lets them figure out things like the poverty line and welfare. And they also collect various types of monitoring data, environmental monitoring, legal monitoring, and so on. So what don't they collect? Well, what wouldn't you tell the government? They generally don't collect opinion data. It's not part of their mandate. They generally don't collect information on things like pets and hobbies, mostly because they don't care. They often don't collect information on non-communicable rare diseases because it's expensive and difficult. They often don't collect information on the homeless population. They may try, but it's pretty difficult for them to get anything really accurate. And they often may collect, but don't publish detailed information on private businesses. Note these specific examples are from the US and Canada. There may be a country out there that does monitor guinea pig ownership and so on. I didn't check. So how? In addition to who, what, and why, it's important to know a bit about how data is collected, as you'll see. There are two main forms of data collection: administrative data collection and surveys. Administrative data is collected as a byproduct of the process of administering something. Private organizations collect a lot of that type. A survey is just data that's collected specifically for the sake of collecting information by going out and asking questions. A census is a survey that tries to include every member of a population. And then there are sample surveys that gather information on particular populations and some populations. All these considerations are worth thinking about. And now I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Liz Hill.
Hi, thanks, Kristi. Hi, everybody. I'm going to carry on into the next section of our presentation and then hand it off to Alex. My section is featuring constraints on data collection and why they matter. It's important to think about parameters associated with data collections and how they affect data as a resource for research. Go ahead, Kristi, thanks. So in this slide, we're featuring issues with sample survey data. The number of people surveyed or the sample size can have a very real impact on how useful the survey data may be for a researcher, especially if a subset of the sample population is of interest to them. For example, even thinking about the census, if someone wanted to know something about women in a certain occupation and income range, suddenly the sample size they're dealing with is smaller and it may not be as relevant or as usable as they thought it might be at the outset. Layered on top of that, for confidentiality reasons, when a data set is becoming available for public use, once you layer on things like the level of geography that the data set is released at, as well as suppression of variables, the actual data set or the subset may not be as usable as the person had hoped. Social surveys done by government may also be done in cycles with predictable years, but at times a cycle can be canceled, or someone may be very interested in the topic and realize that was surveyed in a year that is not part of the period of time they want to examine. So all of these considerations and characteristics of data are often news to students and can be very frustrating. We do share this guidance in our data literacy guide that is part of the ACRL cookbook. Beyond the guidance noted here, it's important to share that just because you want data or hope that it exists for a topic, it doesn't mean that it's there or that you can, or that it's available for you. Also important to note is that conducting surveys costs money. It can be expensive. Funding's required, or it has to be part of the mandate of the organization to do that. And it's possible that continued or repeated cycles of a given survey may not happen due to costs. Other reasons why data may not exist is that public versions of a data set have not been made available because of the sensitive nature of the topic. And as Kristi highlighted above, in the case of populations such as the homelessness, it may be difficult to find that data, or the population may not have been surveyed. Other considerations that we provide in our guide are that you have to think about who is collecting and disseminating the data. If you're thinking of a government organization, they have to, and there's a particular topic you're interested in, they have to have a large enough population for that topic to show up in a national survey, or the topic of concern that the researcher is interested in has to be part of the mandate of the government or agency, or it may not show up in their surveys. We often guide students and researchers to think about what organization might have collected data on the topic that they're interested in. I find geography such an important aspect of data sources, and educating students that we speak to about considering that data are collected and released at a particular level of geography, and depending on issues pertaining to confidentiality and sensitivity, as well as where they were collected from, these are all factors in what will be available for use. A data set such as microdata file from the census can be drilled down to a level of geography of interest, and then the researcher may find that the topic they're interested in isn't available, like at the neighborhood level, for example. So in our slide here, we depict that you might be looking from the top down from a large area, a large census file, or from the bottom up, looking at local organizations. Okay, one more, Kristi. Next one. Students can be guided to break down the question, think about the population and the topic, who would collect the data. And just my final slide here before Alex goes. Statistics can be given as used as an estimation to apply to additional pieces of data that the researcher is using. Now over to Alex. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. So along with these considerations that Liz and Kristi have just gone over, it's also important for the students to learn to distinguish between the types of surveys available. So we want to, excuse me, sorry. We want them to be able to distinguish what each of them are. So we have demographic surveys, which are facts about households such as households, individuals or families, and include data about age, income, residency, drug use, family structure, etc. And then there's social surveys, which tend to include questions about basic attitudes, opinions, and values, and broad trends in society. And public opinion polls, which are quick snapshots of opinion on current topics. And then longitudinal surveys, which provide data over time, tending to follow the same person or unit over time. And then we want to distinguish between facts and opinions. So opinion data can come in two basic forms. You have your opinion poll, which answers the question, who thought what, when? And again, a brief snapshot of a topic and someone's opinion on that. And they often tend to be done by news media. And then there's social surveys, which answer the question, how do these things influence those things? And they're usually collected by academics and look at trends, values, and broad social issues in depth with context. And it's important to note that governments, and to point out that governments are interested in facts more than they are opinions. And it's an important distinction for students to understand to help them choose and use the data properly. Are they using data that is providing someone's opinion on a topic, or are they looking for something that is a fact about a topic? And the time factor is also an important thing to understand. If you're looking at longitudinal surveys, these follow the same people or same unit over time, and researchers keep coming back to this population to when new waves of the survey are conducted. So the surveys are providing a lot of data showing how participants change over time, but because of the response burden, there may be a high attrition rate, which could potentially affect the quality of the data over time. So then if you look at social surveys or opinion polls that are repeated over time, these on the other hand, may be a better source of data to use because they will show general trends and generally tend to be easier to find and have more publicly available data than a longitudinal survey. So on these next slides, I'm just going to show some of the notes that we include from our chapters to help you develop your course and assignments. So the chapter is targeted at students in the social sciences, business and health sciences, or that courses that use data as a source of information. And the assignments, some of the suggestions for potential assignments can include having students create a community profile, finding a prevalence of a health condition within a community, determining an audience for a program, or investigating a social issue. And an ingredients list is included in the chapter that suggests how to select data resources. In an assignment, highlighting the different levels of data availability will help choose what data to use. So if you look at international data, like data from the UN or the World Bank, national data like censuses or national surveys run by governments, or is a local data more appropriate, like municipal data or reports from municipal governments or agencies. And finally, this is the citation for the chapter in the book, the ACRL Data Literacy Codebook, which will be released later this fall. And if you have any questions, our emails are on that slide also. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you. We probably have time for one question before we move on to our last speakers. Does anyone attending remotely or in the room have a question? We have a question back here.
I was curious, is the recipe that you created, is it meant for an undergraduate audience, graduate audience, or either, or any audience that you might be encountering?
The recipe is, we designed it to be customizable. I've used very similar sessions for both graduate and undergraduate classes. It's aimed at data novices, but I've encountered many data novices who are also graduate students, so it is pretty adaptable.
Thank you. All right, we are going to move on to our final session for today, and our speakers are in person. Mari Kleemola is development manager at the Finnish Social Science Data Archive at Tampere University. I'm probably butchering that, sorry. And CESSDA's Tools Working Group leader. She has 20 plus years of experience in data archiving and currently works in several EU-funded projects in tasks focusing on metadata, FAIR, and repository certification. And her co-presenter today is Darren Bell, Director of Technical Services at the UK Data Archive, which is based at the University of Essex. He's been there since 2011, and prior to that worked in the private sector in engineering as a network infrastructure engineer and then a data modeler. He works on a number of CESSDA products, including ELSST and the DDI profiles, as well as being an active member of the DDI community, sitting on the scientific board and the technical committee. He is, and I love this, he is a semantic web evangelist, believing that RDF more accurately reflects our Lord's intended design for creation. So, Mari and Darren, welcome. Or just Mari.
Oh, no. I will start and Darren will continue then. So basically Zoom, where are the Zoom controls? It was there, it was there. Yeah, probably this one. Just. Thank you. I trust everybody is seeing what they should be. So whatever. So what can you see now? Hopefully, yeah. Great, thank you. And it's a great pleasure to be here. So good afternoon, everybody here in the room and also online. So this presentation is written by 4 authors. So Darren and I will be here presenting. I will set the scene and Darren will then, I think, dive into the deeper waters, so to speak. The other 2 authors of this presentation is Broeder from CLARIN, so the linguistic sciences, and Matej Ďurčo from the Austrian Daria, so representing humanities, and Darren and I, we are from the CESSDA community. So this is the sort of the wider group of people. It's not only us 2. And then in this presentation, we are going through a little bit of the SOC project and the background for this Social Science Humanities Vocabulary Commons idea and discussions, the priorities we've had, and then I will show a couple of screenshots on the vocabulary repository, and then it's Darren's turn to talk about the vocabulary management, things that are under discussion at the moment, and also about the versioning. And that's basically the basic structure for this. So I'm sure you've seen the SOC project slide before, so I'm not going to go into detail. So it was a big project for social sciences, humanities. It ended in April, and now we are continuing the work in many areas, and this is one of them. And there's, I mean, I can't start a presentation about vocabularies without mentioning FAIR. But this audience, I'm sure, is pretty well aware of FAIR. So I'm only going to say that the FAIR principles say that your data and metadata should use vocabularies that follow the FAIR principles. So this is sort of the background. This is why we were in the first place doing this, and because we need it. And the SOC project had a lot of activities with regards to vocabularies. They were not always very well coordinated within the project, but it did bring us together to talk about vocabularies, controlled vocabularies, and how to manage them. So I will mention especially work package 3 and the results there, and they are all online, so you can go and Google. But there was a lot of work done on multilingual terminologies. And for example, we tested some machine translations, and well, the conclusion is that you still need humans there. It's not that the machines can do everything, but they can do a lot. We had a task on interoperability, where we, for example, recommended using SCOS for vocabularies. And then, of course, we have the open marketplace that needs to both present vocabularies, but also use vocabularies. In addition, there was a CLARIN and SOC initiated vocabulary meeting series, and all the materials are available online. So if you are really interested, you can take a look at those. And we did have a workshop on vocabulary use in the ICT, I think it's a ICT Enhanced Social Sciences and Humanities. So it's a conference. And of course, we've also collaborated with people from, for example, the Triplet project. So this is a wider community, wider discussions under this one umbrella that we've been having. And it's not only this, and I'm sure everybody in this room will know more about initiatives and ongoing discussions and activities regarding controlled vocabularies. Here we are just mentioning a few. The Eos Interoperability Framework, if you have not read it, do it. It's not too long. There's the big European Eos Future project that now has a metadata working group. FAIR project did a lot of work on this, and there are several new EU-funded projects that are starting, with all have the acronym FAIR in their name. And so many of them will start or have started in May this year, so no results yet. And then we just want to highlight this one article about simple rules for making a vocabulary fair. So if you have a legacy vocabulary, this is a go-to article to see how to manage it and how to make it fair. So just some of the things we are aware of, and I'm sure there are others. So the actual topic, the Social Science Humanities Vocabulary Commons, so as mentioned, started as an initiative when we had the discussions during the SOC project, and that we do bring together experts from these various communities. And the topic of discussions has been using and managing the vocabularies. So very practical approach to this, although it seems that when we start discussing, we get into very deep waters really quickly. And there's a lot of details. There are not that many rules at the moment. We need some conventions, and that's, I mean, it's up to us basically to work towards them. So we want to operate and share and manage the vocabularies, and we need services for that. And we do have some services like the CESSDA vocabulary service at the moment, and we have the SOC vocabulary as well. So we have created this short vocabulary commons charters, and there's a link so you can go and see what we have written down. So some of the priorities in our discussions have, and then within the work, has been to operate a vocabulary repository for the very practical use case of publishing SOC vocabularies. We also want to have a vocabulary overview. We really would like to see a federated content search. There's a lot of work to be done to harmonize versioning of vocabularies, and I'm sure Darren will touch the versioning issue in more detail. Some API standardization should go on, and of course we want to foster exchange. And we've, for example, had discussions with the Cosmos developers. So in short, I mean, and this is a lot already for this very informal group to tackle, but it's a start. So this is the SOC vocabs service, and we have, so this came out from the very practical use case that we need to have something, and this is basically a collaboration between CESSDA, CLARIN and Darren, and it's run by the Austrian colleagues. And this is just a screenshot, it's online, and there's a link, you can go and take a look at it. And I also wanted to show one slide about just one term in that vocabulary, and you can see that it's multilingual, because that's one of the challenges in the SSH field, that we have a lot of multilingual resources, and we also want to have multilingual concepts. We want to document things in a way that is appropriate when you have multilinguality as a value. So this was in short setting the scene, and now I trust Darren to take you into details.
Okay, can everyone, yeah, thanks a lot, Mari. I'm Darren Bell from the UK Data Archive, and I got involved in SHOC a couple of years ago. As Mari says, this is a fairly informal group, and we've been discussing various issues around vocabularies. Now, when it comes to controlled vocabularies, most of us know what a vocabulary is, but when we start to discuss best practices, how do we actually do this properly and formally, it turns out we opened Pandora's box, and there are many, many things that you need to think of when it comes to vocabularies. One of the first difficulties with vocabularies and ontologies for that matter is, how do I know that someone else somewhere in the world hasn't already produced a vocabulary for a particular purpose, rather than everyone constantly reinventing the wheel? So we started thinking about the problem of searching and indexing and registries. And it turns out there's more than one way to skin a cat with this. So the two main approaches we're considering at the moment is whether we have a central index. So if you want to say, I've got a particular concept or a term, let's say health, purely for an example, where can I find that in which vocabularies? Now, one way of doing this is we set up a centralized kind of mega infrastructure where we go out and we periodically index other people's vocabularies and vocabulary registries. Or we can possibly take a more federated search approach, and bearing in mind that everything with EOS can should, wherever possible, be federated rather than centralized. It turns out there are actually some quite complex technical problems with both of those. So we are actually discussing those more over the next couple of months, because ultimately we want to produce a set of best practice recommendations for people who are fairly new to some of the technology as to how to approach this. Okay, so when we talk about federation, we also we're talking about collaboration as well. Vocabularies at the moment are maintained in the main locally by local organizations. It would be great if we can have a more harmonized federated resource, so that there's one vocabulary for one purpose that is used by multiple organizations. Now, in a linked data world, which I'm not going to go into particularly now, we would all reference the same vocabulary from a central location. What a lot of people do at the moment, and in fact the Data Archive does as well with some DDI vocabularies, is we actually take a copy and store it locally. Now, that's not really optimal, because you then lose the tracking and the provenance when the vocabulary changes. How do you know it's changed? How do you make sure you've got the most up-to-date copy? So those are all, real live issues. So we are now thinking about how we build this more federated and distributed model for reuse of management of vocabularies. So thinking about ownership of vocabularies, not just as organization X owns vocabulary Y, organization Z owns vocabulary B, but more of a collective. This sounds all very hippie, I know, but how do you arrange a more collective set of ownership around vocabularies in a more federated way? This again brings its own problems. How do you make sure that there's agreement on who's updating what and when, who publishes, who approves, all of those kinds of things? Okay, so but we do need to establish conventions, because vocabularies are actually one of the pivotal and foundational elements of metadata management. We all know about data and metadata, but I guess vocabularies come under the category of reference data. And if we can have common usage and sharing, then it makes comparability between data and analysis much, much easier and more powerful. So one of the things we talked about as well is versioning. Now, it turns out that everyone kind of knows what versioning is, like they do with happiness, but it's extraordinarily difficult to define when it comes down to it. And certainly within the vocabulary and SCOS world, there are actually no current industry standard best practices to this. If you Google RDF versioning or SCOS versioning, you will get lots of very highfalutin, dry academic papers about set theory and some of the maths. But the missing piece at the moment is a simple best practice guide for beginners, which is how do I approach this problem? So that there are a number of challenges around there, a number of issues. Do you version just the concept scheme or the CV, or do you additionally version the concepts that are part of that CV? It's a hierarchical structure. So how does that change over time? You know, it's kind of a tree structure. So do you just version the top level, the bottom level? What about when you've got multiple languages? If I change the French, do I version the Hungarian? So it is all a bit of a viper's nest. So it does need clearing and disaggregating and some best practice guides being produced. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple of other issues there. You might want to only let people know about releases rather than bothering them with every micro change that you make in a vocabulary. Okay, so just a couple of basic recommendations to start thinking about versioning. Make sure that you understand how your URIs or your identifiers are going to be structured, what kind of versioning patterns you're going to use within there, and avoid natural language where you can. Now, we've had a real world example of this within CESSDA. And it's kind of controversial, but it shouldn't be controversial, really. People always, and I do kind of empathize and sympathize, people always say, well, if I look at something that's on screen, for instance, which is a GUID, you know, I can't read this stuff, it's incomprehensible. But the kind of slightly sneaky answer is, I don't care because you're not supposed to read it. The thing about URIs and linked data is it's machines that are operating on this stuff. So while I kind of totally get that it's good to be able to read a URI and have some way into understanding it, the truth of the matter is it's not a requirement for any of this stuff to work. So yeah, I would certainly recommend that you avoid natural language. I've completely undermined my own argument there by including mode of collection as a CV name. I've done that as a compromise. We said for CVs, you can use natural language, but for concepts, it must be IDs. But, you know, if I was being really strict and hard on myself, mode of collection in this example would be another GUID. But that's our happy compromise with CESSDA. Okay, so don't forget about governance as well. Again, there aren't lots of industry standards, best practices around vocabulary life cycles, and this is something we're working on at the moment as well. Identify your roles, who's responsible for the content, who's responsible for the technical platform. Is it an organization? Is it a named person? Other recommendations here as well. You should have one URI for all languages, and Wendy Thomas, who's sitting in the audience, will know exactly what I'm talking about here. But a French concept, if it's the same concept, it should have the same ID, whether it's English, French, Hungarian, or Ukrainian. So this is such a foundational principle. That's why I made a special point of putting it as a bullet point here. And the reason this is important is that once you start trying to maintain different language versions, you end up in all sorts of metadata hell. So you can disregard my advice, but I would recommend you to follow that practice. And another thing as well, linked data initially appears quite intimidating, and people sometimes get confused with web page URLs. Okay, if you ever see a URI or a purported URI that has HTML in it or that has hash in it, you know it's not a URI. So it's just important to understand the distinction between a URI as a name for a data resource and an HTML page. But again, I get it, it's easy to mix the two up. Okay, so lots of issues that we're working out at the moment, some interesting conversations around versioning and governance and other contextual issues. in terms of what's next, there is a lot of potential for further collaboration around other projects, because vocabularies are such a foundational part of metadata and data management. Within EOS Future and other projects, we'll be looking at how we stand these vocabularies and vocabulary infrastructures more as a kind of service-led infrastructure, so we're clear about what services are being provided and consumed. We want to provide some clear and simple and beginner level guidance, saying, I know what a code list is, how do I get into the world of SCOSS, what do I need to do? Because I was there 10 years ago, and initially it can be intimidating, but I promise you, SCOSS is actually not that hard once you've got past a couple of initial concepts that you need to wrap your hand around, and it will open up a whole new world of possibilities for you. Okay. So thank you very much. And if you're interested, please contact us and join the discussion.
Anyone online have questions? Something in the chat here? Not sure. Oh. Any questions, or is everyone wants to go for coffee? Alles klar. Okay. Thank you all so much for coming and attending, and go and have some coffee break. Bye. Thank you online. It's fika time. No. Oh no. Oh.
There were some guidelines actually how to.
Oh no, I'm worried if I
Press end and choose leave meeting.
choose